child a sex. And, you know, so, so she said, because, you know, I, as a woman, identify with my being a woman and biological, you know, blah, blah, blah. Part of being a woman is part of my identity. And so I, of course, raised my hand and said, well, you're assuming that everybody identifies very strongly with their biological sex. I was like, that's not necessarily true. It's like some people might identify more with their gender expression, and, you know, you can't make a decision on someone else's sex because you feel that, you know, you identify with it, so therefore everybody else does. It's like you can't make a universal conclusion like that.
Right.
So it was just really interesting.
And along those lines, we were talking with Samantha Gomes, whose class will be at tomorrow afternoon.
Yep.
The APA has put out their current draft status for the new DSM-5, which will go into effect in 2013. They've published it, I think it's dsm5.org, for public and professional review and comment. And they've made some very significant changes to the gender identity disorder category, in large part because of things that we've learned just exactly along these lines. One of the big ones I remember them mentioning was they basically took the word sex out of most all of the definition and replaced it with gender. Because one of the problems that they had was for folks that are XXY, for folks that have chromosomal trisoming or more, or monosoming, X0, there's a certain little catch with them actually legally identifying as male or female from a sex standpoint, because they don't meet the criteria. And the definition had been very heavily based on, I want to be the other sex. Well, if you can't really identify with one sex or the other, how can you want to be the other? It's a problem with the basic assumption of a polar nature of sex and gender. So they've made some changes to how that all got worded that was very reassuring. But.
Our little contribution.
Wow, there were a lot of very positive changes, but they've got to go through the review period, got to go through the comment and review period, and then they'll put out another draft. But
yeah, it's a good thing though.
Speaking of progressive things.
Progressive things.
Progressive things. I was on the internet the other day, and I was in the Amtrak system, whatever, filling something out. And when I went to the whole gender drop-down, there are now 3 options. There are 3 options for Amtrak. You can have an M, an F, or a T.
Wow.
Okay.
I was like, well, this is fantastically progressive.
Wow.
I was so excited about it. I've never seen that before.
I have a friend who's a software developer, and at one of his previous jobs, he was working on a team developing some software for inpatient work at hospitals. And somebody on the team, when they were going through the various different parts of the code, had asked a question. They said, you know, on the intake form, they have various different values that are valid for different fields. And when it came to gender, they had M, F, and O.
Other.
And she goes, well, why on earth would you need an O? And my friend, being a good friend, launched into an explanation about transgender people.
Wow.
Here's the funny part. The reality for the O is because a lot of times people come into the emergency room before they get information, so they just don't know when they book the bed.
Right.
But I was very proud of him that he didn't come up with that answer first. So yeah, that's very exciting.
Yeah. What were you saying that you saw something before that had like 4 options?
Oh yeah, a friend of mine was filling out a survey, something to do with law, I believe, something, I don't remember, and she said that they had 4 options. Male, female, intersexed, and other.
Yeah.
So I was like really excited about that. I was just like, yay! And it was pretty awesome.
Yeah,
I was really excited.
that exactly addresses the thing the APA was talking about.
We don't live in an all or nothing world.
You know, unless we change our legal definitions.
Sure.
But so that's very cool.
And it's interesting because you know, people just don't know that. You know, day-to-day life, you really think about that.
Right.
And so that's what we're here for, to make sure everybody knows that there aren't just 2 genders.
Right.
You know, the world is a very diverse place. It really is.
But then this 3rd option thing, I went off thinking about it. And I had two different thought processes about it. One, that's really interesting data collection to be able to have that on record.
Sure.
That is really interesting, and I'd love to see where that goes. And the other thing I thought about is like, do I want to put that?
Right.
Do I want to single myself out? Do I want to like mark myself for that?
Depends on what part of the country you're traveling in.
Well,
I mean, in a real sense.
And there's a real personal preference that goes along with that, because certainly even within the trans community, there are people who very strongly identify as female, and they want to be seen as female. They want to be female. They want to be an F on a form.
Right.
And then there are people who, gender queer, gender nonconforming, folks that fall between the M and the F. And some days more frequently, less frequently. And in that case, maybe you don't want to be identified as an M or an F. Maybe you want to be identified as not M or F, whatever that not ends up being.
But then what if now that you have more options, now it takes away the option to identify as an M or an F? Now that you
Yes,
can
and of
choose
course,
the T.
that's the bathroom question, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing that comes up with bathrooms all the time, is we need a third bathroom for people who aren't male or female. Well, maybe, but you shouldn't force people, you shouldn't be pigeonholing people who don't fit the polar binary into a third bathroom just to get them out of yours.
Right, and then at what
If-
point
if-
do you qualify for the bathroom?
Right. How far along does the gender spectrum do you have to be before you trip over that line?
Sure. Maybe we just should have one.
Well, that's,
That's what the family bathroom is for.
ultimately, that's the Ally McBeal solution.
Sure, the unisex.
At one point, do you get out of the unisex bathroom? When do you qualify? It's always like a weird issue. It's like, when do you not qualify for the T on the gender? When does that happen? Maybe we can have, maybe there's like a check sheet.
Although, as much as it's a little scary, it would also be kind of interesting to see it set up, because right out of the gate, they'd want to put that threshold at 5 and 95%. So there's this huge middle ground, and you just watch that middle bucket sort of fill up with all the people out there that aren't extreme male or extreme female.
Yeah.
I don't think people really realize how many people are out there that don't like the polar nature of sex and
Yeah,
gender.
yeah.
Even if they're not identifying themselves as trans, they just, it's just too strong sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah,
the
it's interesting
the
that the
stereotypes
numbers
are too-
are much greater than people realize. We actually have a phone call.
We do. And you're wearing a mood ring.
Yes, I am. I will explain the mood ring in a few minutes. Let's take this phone call. Good evening, NLC Trans. You're on the air.
Could you explain the bisexuality? What makes you the bisexuality? Whether you want to be man with a man or a woman.
Explain bisexuality.
Well, okay, go ahead.
I'm not sure.
Bisexuality is considered a sexual orientation.
And it's even kind of out of date now.
And
Yeah.
Well, it's only because it's such a stigmatized category that a lot of people, unfortunately, identify as other labels, because bisexuality is so stigmatized
Sure.
as being a promiscuous person or whatever.
Sure.
But the, I guess, definition is somebody who is attracted to both males and females.
Yeah. And certainly a lot of us are. I consider myself bisexual.
Good.
And certainly, maybe not dead center on the spectrum, but it doesn't mean that I'm promiscuous, and it certainly doesn't. And one of the interesting things is that people often think, and I had an ex-boyfriend who was crazy about this. It drove him nuts. This was Dan. It drove him nuts
Yes.
that I was bisexual, because he couldn't understand how I could be with him and not have to also be with a woman.
Yeah.
Right, that's what I'm saying, is there's a lot
Right.
of stereotypes
Yeah.
and stigmatizations behind the term.
And this notion that you want to be with a man and a woman, I think it's been unfortunate, and it's ended up being very stigmatized. I think it's unfortunate that in English that sounds like I want to be with both at the same time.
Right.
Yeah.
And which is why when I'm talking to people about being bisexual, I usually describe it as being attracted to a person without regard for their gender.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's more like under the definition of like pansexual.
Pansexual, omnisexual, multisexual.
Which at this point it's like,
which,
Who
as,
cares anymore?
as Kyle said, is, you know, a lot of people have flocked away from this bisexual label